Welcome to part two of the Role of the Board Secretary video series. My name is Scott Vaughn and I'm with the Community Development Unit of the Government of Alberta. The goal of this video series is to introduce you to the role of the Board Secretary of a nonprofit board. In this series, we'll explore the responsibilities of the Board Secretary, the various ways that the Board Secretary assists the board, how board secretaries perform their duties in small and large nonprofit organizations, and how they can best perform in their role as the secretary of the board. The information and concepts presented in this video series are from a board member perspective and are at an introductory level. So this series focuses on the information you need to know if you're a first-time nonprofit board secretary, are considering becoming a board secretary, or are looking for a refresher on the subject. Please note that the information presented in these video recordings and the related materials are not intended to constitute legal advice, the rendering of legal concepts, consulting, or other professional services of any kind. We simply want to share with you information that we think will be helpful as you navigate your organization through its operations. We're not lawyers, chartered accountants, and other kinds of professionals, so for your own organization's specific situations, questions related to the material that we present, you may need to seek advice from a professional in the related area. We also have several resources related to this topic that you may find helpful. The links and resources can be found in the course in the Nonprofit Learning Center or in the description of the video on YouTube. In part two of the Role of the Board Secretary video series, you'll be able to explain the activities and actions that help the Board Secretary fulfill their 5 key functions, and identify related templates and resources that will make the job easier. Now we're going to dive a little deeper into the 5 functions of the board secretary and describe some activities and actions that the board secretary can perform to support these functions. These activities include administration of meetings, meeting minutes, in-camera meetings, being assertive at meetings, correspondence, records and documents, filing and storage, virtual meetings, and orientation of new board members. Now let's start our deeper dive by looking at administration of meetings. It is the responsibility of the board secretary to ensure that important dates on the calendar of the organization and board are highlighted for all board members. This calendar is a guide for the board secretary to ensure that all important organizational information is ready when needed. In addition to a schedule of board meetings, it is crucial for the board secretary to remind the board of important dates, such as the annual general meeting, the AGM, if you will, reports to funders, and any other activities that are important to the organization, so the board can discuss the related details and prepare for these events and milestones well in advance. An important note, we can say that the board secretary has the most responsibility to ensure the organization documents are up to date and shared with the organization and externally as well. With this in mind, it is also the board secretary that submits the annual return of the organization, often to corporate registry. And depending on the size of the organization, there may be others involved in the creation of the annual return, but it is the board secretary that ensures the work is done in a timely fashion so that the annual return can be completed and submitted on time. Let's look at what the board secretary needs to do before a meeting to ensure that the board members have up-to-date information and time to review the materials that will be discussed during the meeting. It is generally accepted practice to send out the meeting notifications and materials, including a list of outstanding agenda items from past meetings, 1 week before the date of the meeting. However, the board secretary may decide to send the materials out sooner, especially if the next meeting includes new documents or many additions to existing paperwork, or maybe very important documents such as the year-end financial statements, the annual report, the yearly financial audit that needs to be submitted to corporate registry. The board secretary may want to have a conversation with the board chair and the other board executive members to decide what's the most critical documents are and how much time the rest of the board might need to review them properly before the next meeting. Some of these key documents include agendas, reports, Minutes. Keep in mind that the organization will need to plan the development and submission of the year-end documents several months in advance so that there's time to develop, finalize, and distribute them in advance of the annual general meeting and submit them to Alberta Corporate Registry. Now let's think about a few actions that are connected to the administration of meetings that we just chatted about. Things like distributing meeting information, calendar of important dates, submitting to the annual return to corporate registry. Now, choose one of the tasks that are associated with the secretary's duty to administer meetings that you see on the screen and describe at least one aspect of how that is currently done in your organization. For example, you may choose the calendar of important dates and say, we keep a list of important dates that the board needs to know to trigger specific action that is reviewed every year. This could be like things like, when the AGM needs to be held or when the annual return it needs to be submitted to corporate registry. So you can pause the video now and think about the answers to these questions. If you don't know the answer, maybe that's something you need to discuss at your next board meeting. One of the most important roles of the board secretary is to record the minutes of board meetings. The minutes are an important record of the decisions of the board, so it's important that they are easily accessible, they're done in a consistent way, and that they record the same type of information for each meeting. The meeting minutes need to record what was accomplished and decided upon during the meeting, who was at the meeting and who was absent, and what follow-up commitments were made for what action, and when and where the next meeting will take place. This is a sample of a meeting minutes template. The template is fairly simple. It includes all the details that will provide a record of the meeting that will be useful in the future, long after the meeting is over. The first 4 points take care of the start of the meeting. Some points provide highlights, like number 5, reports, while others provide exact wording where it's needed. Number 6, like motions is an example, and number 7, committee assignments and assigned tasks. Exact wording is needed for those. It ends in preparation for the next meeting, an official close to the current meeting. This template is available in the resources section of this course. Recording the minutes requires a balance between providing enough information about the discussions and decisions while avoiding too much detail. The template we just looked at describes when it's okay to provide highlights and when clear details are needed. The board secretary may want to look at previous meeting minutes to determine whether more detail is needed, or if there's room to summarize the minutes to make it easier for board members to understand not only the decision, but also how the decision was made. A good test is to talk to a board member who missed the meeting to find out if they were able to understand the decision and why that decision was made just by reading the minutes. Meeting minutes will also help the board secretary prepare for the next board meeting. When the board secretary and the board chair begin preparations for the next meeting, it is very useful to look over the previous meeting minutes to ensure that any unfinished business and requested actions are part of the agenda for the next meeting. Also, having a record of the minutes of several meetings in a row can give the board secretary a good indication of how much of the board's business and actions are being completed. If the meeting minutes of a few consecutive meetings are about the same discussions and decisions, that might be a sign that the board needs to think about how it can improve its ability to make decisions that can be implemented by the organization. Now let's talk about the closing of a board meeting. The board secretary has taken good notes, creates good meeting minutes, asks questions of clarity when it's needed so that the minutes are clear and concise. The next task for the board secretary is to complete the minutes and send them to the board chair and all of the board members as soon as is possible. Now, the board secretary should consider how to store the minutes. To store the minutes, here are some questions that board secretaries should consider. Is there a safe place where the official copy of the minutes could be stored? Is there an electronic copy of the meeting minutes? If so, who has access to them? The answers to these questions may be some items that the board secretary could discuss at one of the board meetings. As I mentioned before, having a backup minute taker for the board secretary is a good idea. If the board secretary has to miss one of the board meetings, it is important to have a good sub who can take minutes in their absence. The board secretary should make sure that is someone who is familiar with the board style of minute taking and give them enough time as a new person to prepare and meet with them if necessary. There may be some confusion as to whether or not the board secretary is also the secretary for committee meetings. The board secretary is only in that role for meetings of the board, not for committee meetings. Being a member of a committee is not the same as being the secretary of the committee. So the board secretaries may be a part of other committees, but they don't have that same secretary role. One aspect of committee work that the board secretary should be aware of is ensuring that recommendations proposed by the committees are properly recorded at board meetings. This is not about the role of the board secretary in the committee, but rather their role as the board secretary of the board. They need to ensure that all committee recommendations are recorded and accessible to all board members. Think of your board meeting minutes. What is one helpful practice that your board follows about the style, recording, or storing of your board meeting minutes? For example, you may say in our organization, minutes are reviewed by the board secretary and one other person before they're distributed to the board. What are some other helpful practices that you have in your organization or you think could help your organization? Here is a list of some important documents for the board secretary to be familiar with. It'll greatly help the whole board if the board secretary is familiar with all of these documents and has them readily available during meetings. It is important for each board member to have easy access to the agenda and past meeting minutes. Legislation, bylaws, and policies are documents that may contain information related to the organization's meetings, such as board meetings, the annual general meeting, special meetings, committee meetings, etc. Another important record and document to have available is quorum guidelines that set out the minimum number of board members that must be in attendance in order to make decisions at board meetings and at the annual general meetings. This information is mentioned in the organization bylaws, but there may be some other information about board meetings in the policies as well when it comes to quorum guidelines. Note, if there is no quorum, then the decisions made in the meeting are not official legal decisions of the board. Despite this, keep in mind the board members present may decide that it's still useful to hold the meeting anyway. The rest of the list that you see on the slide includes other documents that the board secretary may want to have available to consult during board meetings. All of these documents together create a good understanding of the organization, how it operates, and what decisions have already been made. With this information, the board secretary will be able to guide the board towards good discussions and decisions, and to avoid discussions that have already happened and decisions that have already been made. When thinking about the organization, the board secretary should consider what documents should be added to this list as well. Now let's talk about in-camera meetings. In-camera meetings are the portion of a meeting that is not open to the public due to sensitive, confidential information that is being shared. In-camera sessions are private, so the discussions that take place in camera are not recorded in the meeting minutes. However, the decisions and motions, whether made in camera or in the regular portion of the meeting, must be recorded. How the board secretary does it depends on the bylaws or policies of the organization. To avoid a confusion about which part of the board meeting was public and which part of the board meeting was in camera, the board secretary should record when the board went in camera and when the board came out of camera back to the regular portion of the meeting. There are times during board meetings when the board secretary needs to be assertive and bring certain matters to the attention of the chair, even if the meeting is energetic and moving fast. Here are some of those times. If an official organization meeting, like a regular board meeting or a special meeting, is starting and there's no quorum, again, meaning the minimum number of board members or membership are not present, the board secretary needs to respectfully let the board chair know before the meeting starts. This ensures that the chair is aware of the situation and can then speak to the board members and everyone present in order to clarify that, without quorum, the proceedings of this meeting, including any decisions are made, are not valid or enforceable, and even if they decide to go ahead with the meeting. Another example when to be assertive. Secretaries should always make sure to ask for clarification whenever they're not sure about what was said, or if they've not heard someone talking, or if they need to clarify the meaning of what was said. Meeting processes are very important. So if the board misses part of the voting process or forgets an agenda item, the board secretary should bring these things to the attention of the chair so the chair can correct the situation and bring the meeting back to the agreed upon process. The last point is a good example of how important a board secretary can be. If the board wants to move forward but they still have not made the required decisions to do so, the board secretary should speak up. For example, the board may want to approve an important expenditure for the next fiscal year, but they have not approved the yearly budget yet. So in this situation, in this example, the board secretary should mention this to the chair so they do not spend time on budget decisions until the budget is approved. Here are some more instances when the board secretary needs to be assertive. The board secretary needs to be assertive when the board is making a motion or policy on a matter for which there's already a decision or policy in place. In these cases, the board secretary should mention it to the chair, and the entire board handles it from that point. Another time to be assertive is when the board is making a policy or motion that is outside the scope of the board's responsibilities. Board responsibilities are outlined in the external documents of the organization, such as the Societies Act, and in their internal documents, such as bylaws, policies, and procedures. So if the board is making a motion or policy on something that is not within the scope of its responsibilities based on these documents, the board secretary should mention this to the board. These first 2 points are great examples of how the board secretary's knowledge of the board's past decisions can save the board a lot of time. It also ensures that the board is not contradicting existing decisions, which could cause problems for the board and the entire organization. A board secretary needs to ensure that board meeting policies are correctly implemented. For example, a board meeting may be running late, even though there's a policy in place that all board meetings must end at a certain time. The board secretary should bring this to the attention of the chair to see how the chair and the rest of the board want to proceed. The entire board can decide to end the meeting, or they can create a motion to extend the meeting, for example, in this case. Other examples when to be assertive, or final point on assertiveness at meetings. As we mentioned earlier, it is important to note that the board secretary is a board member too. The board secretary participates in the discussions and decision-making of the board like all other board members. This means the board secretary can make motions, ask questions, participate in discussions, and vote on decisions of the board. When the board secretary needs to do this, sometimes they should have someone else on the board take the minutes and act as the board secretary while they exercise their other non-board secretary roles and responsibilities. Okay, let's move on to correspondence. The task of the board secretary is to make sure that all the related significant communications, correspondence, and other documents that the organization receives are shared with the board members in a timely manner. Therefore, it is also important for the board secretary to make sure there is an up-to-date contact list of board members and key internal and external contacts of the nonprofit organization. This helps ensure efficient meetings. When board members have materials far enough in advance of the meeting, they can prepare for the meetings with comments and questions. The board secretary is also responsible to make sure that all the correspondence of the board with outside or external stakeholders is sent and received in a timely manner. To ensure effective internal and external communication, it's important that the organization address mailing address, contact information, all of those are up to date. Further, the board secretary should make sure that the information is up to date in corporate registry documents as well. Also, if there are contacts in the organization's correspondence list that are no longer needed or valid, the board secretary needs to ensure they are removed. Now, the question is, what documents should the secretary file and store? Here are some key board documents that the secretary usually keep in physical or online filing systems. Objects, bylaws, and their incorporation documents. Policies and procedures. Minutes and agendas. Financial documents, things like budget, various financial statements, and others. Annual returns, things like annual returns to corporate registry if the organization is a society. Organization member contact lists. Strategic plan. And also minutes and templates of annual general meetings. The board secretary should ensure these are all updated too when needed. And depending on the type of organization you are, there may be other documents that the board secretary may need to include in the nonprofit's filing system. Some of them are on the slide. You can see charitable status, for example, if the nonprofit has official registered charity status through Canada Revenue Agency. Official tax receipts, according to CRA guidelines. Staff salary or hiring information. This could also include job descriptions, administration information, board orientation information. For example, orientation manuals that contain key documents for easy reference for both new and existing board members. Key funder and grant application information. Organizational brochures or pamphlets. Professional development or conference information. These are the types of documents that a nonprofit may be keeping in its filing system. But how does a board secretary deal with the issue of records management and keep track of all of this information? Records management refers to a system that ensures that the content and location of all documents is clear and that they can be accessed easily during board meetings. If there is a system in place, the board secretary needs to be familiar with it. If there's no records management system in the organization, the board secretary can set one up themselves. A records management system is basically a set of rules and procedures about how to name files and how to store them so that they can easily be located and accessed. There is a link to 2 courses on records management from the University of British Columbia in the toolkit that cover beginner and advanced levels management. These courses teach board secretaries everything from how to name files, how to manage emails, how to manage shared drives, how to store records. And they cover both online and paper copy records management. They are good courses that can help board secretaries who want to create an effective and efficient record management system. In the resources sections of this course, there are also some resources on records management and information management to help secretaries set up their system. All members of the board can help with the orientation of new board members. However, given the board secretary's knowledge of the organizations, its processes, and documentation, this makes them an important part of board orientation. New board members need a thorough onboarding to have some good basic information so they can hit the ground running. Some of the main duties in this onboarding processes are helping new board members get familiar with the organization and the members who run it, creating a board orientation handbook and give it to new board members, reviewing the policies and expectations with them and help them to understand all of this information, and giving helpful tips to new board members on how to prepare for board meetings. A lot of new board members may be anxious about their new responsibilities. So the board secretary is an important part of a smooth and welcoming onboarding process to help new board members take on the responsibilities with confidence. A thorough and welcoming process will help new board members feel welcome and provide a good first step with their board experience and knowledge. There are several resources available on how the board secretary can assist with board orientation, as well as other board secretary related material, and their links are in the resources section of this course. All right, what are some of the key learnings you've had from this board secretary course? That brings us to the end of the second video on the role of the board secretary. Thank you for watching. Our contact information is on the slide and is in the contact CDU section of the course as well. If you are in Alberta and have a question and need further information or would like to request our services, you can contact us by email or phone. If you want to be notified of our future services and resources, you can add your email address to our subscription form and you'll receive updates as they become available. The link to the subscription form is in the description of the video as well. So on behalf of the Community Development Unit, thank you for your attention, take care, and always remember that our communities have so much more because of everything you do. Thank you.